Okay, good afternoon and welcome to session 5R. What is RACF industry best practice? This session has been recorded and it will be available on our website a couple of weeks after the conference ends, and it will be shown on the website on the agenda page by a little reel of film. Old style film, that is. Please provide feedback to us. There's 3 ways in which you can do it. You probably got bored with people telling you this already, but you can go to the agenda page, click on the cell. That will throw up a page about the meeting information. At the bottom of that page is a link to the feedback. On your BYO page, which you should all be using, there's a link there to go to the feedback. Using either of those 2 sessions, it will fill in your registration number. The final way is at the end of this presentation, you'll see a QR code. And if you scan that in, that will take you to the page as well, but it won't fill the number in for you. Questions. If you've got any questions to them, could you put them into the chat and I will endeavor to stop Daniel as he's going through to answer those questions. If I fail to do that, we will cover them at the end. Right, so I'll hand you over to Daniel now and this presentation.
Okay. Hello. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever it'll be. Today's session is what are RACF industry best practices? And we're going to be discussing the CIS benchmarks for RACF, a little bit of background information about, here's our agenda. We got a bit of a disclaimer and introduction, history of CIS benchmarks, and a little bit about CIS benchmarks in general, an introduction to a CIS benchmark recommendation, how it's structured, a deep dive and preview of changes for the draft release, how to get involved with CIS benchmarks, and we're going to highlight some open community discussions that point to a preview of new recommendations. So, disclaimer, I'm Daniel Burke. I'm presenting in my capacity as a contributor to the CIS IBM ZOS RACF benchmark and the current draft update. I just want to stress that by industry best practices, usually most of what we talk about are minimally acceptable security practices. This will not necessarily result in the most hardened system if you follow them, but they will give you a good baseline for a securable system. A little bit of background about the CIS benchmarks in general. The CIS refers to the Center for Internet Security. It's a nonprofit organization founded in 1999, so about 25 years ago, with the mission of creating a more secure internet. In the early 2000s, CIS recognized the need for a standardized security configuration to protect critical infrastructure and systems, mostly cloud-based, as you can guess from the Center for Internet Security, which led to the creation of the first benchmarks. Currently, there are more than 100 community-developed secure configuration benchmarks across 25 vendor products and families. They're available as free PDFs that are downloadable for non-commercial use. The key here is that these benchmarks represent technical configuration standards that are community-driven and community-influenced. So although vendors may be involved in the creation and maintenance of a benchmark, they are not owned or coming from the vendor. So a little bit of background on the RACF benchmark specifically. So back in the year 2020, so about 5 years ago, IBM was focusing on compliance for the Z platform. At that time, let's say industry best practices for RACF security was a mix of, you had your DISA STIGs from the US Department of Defense, secure technical implementation guides. There were various informal RACF configuration cookbooks maintained by different IBM services team. Each services team kind of had their cookbook of what to look for and suggest people configure for RACF. And there was various information and tips scattered across RACF mailing lists, presentations from shares, GS conferences like this, and so on. It was a very fragmented landscape. So you had a mix of a very DISA specific and US centric STIG guidelines, which often were, created from an organization that had classified systems, unclassified systems, and a very, very well-defined internal hierarchy and role-based structure. Or you had tips that may, on the RACF mailing list or from GS share slides that may or may not still be relevant or may be replaced by enhancements and maintenance to RACF. So based on customer feedback, IBM looked at the CIS benchmarks, saw that they had a community consensus-driven nature, and we took about the next 2 years consolidating and adjusting all of the existing content from various internal cookbooks, internal IBM sourced presentations from GS, Share, Slide, so on like that, and coalescing it into a more than 200 plus recommendations in the first CIS benchmark for RACF. I'll say you probably noticed that the big contributor on there is Mark Nelson, who's in there in this, so they're good recommendations. There are currently 4 total benchmarks. There's for ZOS with RACF, DB2 on ZOS, CICS transaction server, and Red Hat Linux on IBM Z Linux. The IBM Z WebSphere benchmark also has IBM Z content. So these are all of the Z benchmarks. So what does a benchmark contain? So it contains a description, which summarizes the recommendation. This explains the intent behind the recommendation. The rationale, this explains why you would want to follow this recommendation. Now, optionally, there's an impact statement section. That impact section is supposed to discuss the gains you would get from implementing a recommendation, but we have chosen to put any warnings or considerations there that would impact performance or administrative changes. The audit section, it defines how you would see if what the requirements are for benchmark and how you can check if they've been implemented correctly. And then a remediation section that goes through, some sample commands for fixing it. So there are a few additional components to a benchmark. There's a default value, may or may, it's an optional one. References section. In our case, we've used that to provide a mapping between DSys STIG controls and the CIS benchmark. Just want to caveat that by saying that if you follow a CIS benchmark recommendation, it does not mean you've satisfied a DSys STIG control, but we know that DSys STIG controls, being sort of the de facto standard for RACF best practices, this provides an easy transition for people. You can scan through there, and if you follow if you want to use a CIS benchmark and you're already using a STIG control, you can check that references section there to say, well, okay, these map. There's also a mapping between the CIS benchmark, which are the technical guidelines, and the CIS critical security controls. It's sort of a cross-platform meta standard. If you're familiar with things like NIST, it's a higher level standard where it'll say things like, secure accounts and so on like that. It allows you to take different benchmarks across various specific platforms and map them to a shared standard. That's an area of improvement we're looking to improve upon, because we know that people have said that auditors are asking, well, how does this map to the CIS critical? Because they're used to seeing the CIS critical security controls, because it comes from various cloud and Windows and server platforms. There's an additional information. I've taken great pains myself to go through and make sure that it links to the appropriate IBM reference manuals for all the controls. And there's an assessment status. This is more important. It really indicates whether or not a control could be automated or if it's always going to be manual. It's not an indication of whether or not this has been implemented by a specific tool. This is just this is something that you could test programmatically, or this is something that's going to require a manual review. Then there's profile applicability. This is usually mapped as a level 1 control and a level 2 control. It's not a severity. All recommendations are generally considered to be at the same severity by CIS benchmark. There's no concept of severity. It's not a prioritization indicator. Again, these are minimally acceptable best practices. So I would say implement them all. There's, one is not more important than the other, in my opinion. Mainly what the level 1 and level 2 means. specifically for the RACF CIS benchmark is whether or not this will impact your performance, the potential for impacting performance, not a guarantee to impact performance, but a potential for impacting performance. We'll get a little bit more on that later. So these are examples of those level 2 recommendations. I guess the later is now. For example, one of the recommendations, 116, ensure that the KDFS algorithm is used to protect passwords. When it was first introduced, it was not, it required some optimization in APARs to remove any potential for system performance. So it was, when it was introduced, level 2 recommendation, because if you did it, you could potentially have impact to your system performance in specific cases. Now that's been kind of addressed. So in the next release, it's going to be a level 1 recommendation. So it should, you know, another one is 24112 and 246. So 246 was a control relating to the exit modules, libraries containing exit modules. So 246 is the main control, and it said UAC of read is acceptable for exit libraries. Enough people got complaints. They're like, well, you know, it was originally UAC of none when we created the control, but enough people complained that what we did is we split that control. So we have 246, which allows for UAC of read, and then an extension 2412, which is same requirements, but it changes it to be a more strict control of UAC of none. And another example is, so you can see how that a level 1 control can have basically the same logic, but at different levels of strictness. And then 930, FS access. In certain environments, that can cause some increased CPU usage, so it's a level 2 control. Okay. I'm mentioning a draft of the upcoming release. So this release is developed in public. You can log onto the CIS website. It's free. You do have to register for an account, as you do for most things, but it's a free account. Here's the little scan here. I put a QR code. You can go view it right now. See all the work we've been doing right now. The big focus on this release has been ensuring that titles are consistent for controls. That's just kind of a personal thing. Ensuring that the audit and remediation procedures are much more complete and consistent, and going through and making sure the default values, references, and additional information are populated. Now, as it says on my bio, I work with the zSecure team. So we were the team responsible for implementing internally at IBM the automated tooling for performing the evaluation to this benchmark. Because we did a lot of, we actually had to implement the controls. So I had a lot of going back to Mark and Anuja and the people who were responsible, you know, on the editing board at IBM for this, and saying, well, what did you mean by this control? Did you actually mean this and this and this and this? And eventually I just kind of rewrote all 215 plus controls and put them up in the thing, and that's kind of where the current draft release is. Again, here's how you can get to the benchmark. Once you go there, you would just search for the RACF benchmark. We have a version, published versions. We have the initial release, second release, and now this new release here. And this is just another slide to show that. We're dropping the any sort of notation of the ZOS version from the RACF benchmark. The RACF benchmark should apply to continue, you know, currently supported RACF and ZOS. So here's an example of what the audit procedure looked like in the old version and what it starts to look like in the new version. Now you can see in the new version, much more detailed. I can't fit it all on this one screen. It was very not pretty when I tried to. So this particular control was about making sure that your started tasks use the started class profile and not the RIN3 table, or at least that's what the description was, but the audit procedure only said to check if a user is assigned via started, you know, check the started profiles with our list. Let's walk through a lot of the changes that are happening in the audit section. So a big change is that all the controls, or recommendations, I should say recommendations, I may use control interchangeably, correct term is recommendation. All the recommendations now include verifying that the class is active. This was left as an implicit step. We've added it now so that all the recommendations can be run independently. We debated having one master recommendation that said to activate classes that were going to be checked, and then the controls would assume that the other recommendations would assume that you've run that one. But you know, we thought it would be a little bit better that people could adopt this piecemeal or pick and choose what they wanted to run from the CIS benchmark. So we decided to include that in every recommendation. We've also included some minimum best practices, like the rack list requirements. A lot of that's coming just from like the IBM command reference manual, the RACF command reference guide. This is where we could use some help from the community. Good place to put which classes should or should not be rack listed. But minimum best practices. Another big thing, if there is an existing DSMON report, I should go back and say one thing, that all of these recommendations are not written for tooling specific. They're all written to be, the only things you need for the recommendations are RACF and ZOS. We don't provide any specific method for the data. If a method exists, such as DSMON, if there's a DSMON report for it, we'll include it here. If you have an equivalent tool that provides that information, Vanguard, Zsecure, your own tooling, that's okay. We just provide only native tools in all of the audit sections. So it's not a tool-specific security recommendation guideline. We tried to use DSMON where we could. In this case, it's a good one for the started tasks, because this will tell you which, list all the started tasks and how they were resolved, whether it was RIN3 or started. Again, it was not very well mentioned. A lot of the controls assumed that the global access checking was not, the global access was not being used to grant access. We've now included that as a hard requirement to not use that. Now, we've made no recommendations about global access itself. So that's why it'll say things like global access for this entry is inactive, has no entries, which means global access is active for the class, but it's not actually checking anything, or no entries specific to the resource in the recommendation. We just want to make sure that these highly sensitive resources are not granted, global access, which is not logged in SMF. And this is perhaps the biggest change, IRRDBU00 reporting. So before we'd used native RACF commands, but native RACF commands depend on what privilege you have, the information they return. So if you do not have auditor, you don't get the full information. If you do not have, there are too many variables for how much information you can get from a command, whereas a database unload provides a flat file representation of a RACF database. So it's a very consistent source of data. We also focused on what the content was required to be present in the report instead of prescribing a specific format. And that's because the RACF database unload just produces a flat file. If you've ever seen it, it's documented in the RACF manuals, got macros and interfaces guide. It produces, record out of that, formats the records. So what we say is, okay, instead of telling you what that could look like, because you could access it with df sort, sync sort, dzretrieve, rex, you could load in db2, load into a different database, take it off system, load in access. There are many ways to report on this data. So what we chose to focus on is what that report that is generated should contain, and it makes it more clear what we're trying to check. So this is again related to that started task profile. Make sure there's at least one backstop profile here, so that everything does not fall back to the RIN3 task. We ensure that that backstop profile is assigned to a valid RACF group and a RACF user ID. And we ensure that that RACF user ID and group does not have any real access. That way, you have to at least define starter profiles. We don't say how many starter profiles you have to define, but there should at least be one backstop to prevent RIN3 fallback. And that backstop should not be generally used. You want something to come up, hit the backstop. It should pretty much fail with access requests, because you should have a more qualified profile. You shouldn't have most of your started tasks going through it. Another change for this is we've also included audit recommendations. This was previously not included, and they're meant to be minimum recommended audit levels. So if you audit at a higher level, it's good, but this is a guideline for what the benchmark community thinks is sort of a minimum level to collect relevant records. So it's going to be almost always failures read because almost everything needs to know, PCI DSS or all the other standards really require you to know who was trying to do what unauthorized users were trying to access and what they were trying to access. Success comes through a little bit more sparingly because that can increase the amount of records there, but we try to usually suggest success auditing at a successful level of update and higher for things to allow you to track changes. So when you go through, say, a PCI DSS audit and they say, well, can you prove that tell me what changed and where? Here's an SMF or 80 record, and then you can match that with your change management system. That's a lot of the things they do there. Another change, if there is a ZOS health check that covers it, we include it as an alternative. You have to kind of deliberately disable the ZOS health checker at this point, but we included it as a source because it's a good way to get some things. Remediation procedure. This just kind of show you a bit of the difference, how we would define, one or two commands, and now we go through notes if we have them that are useful. This is back to that RIN3 control where we point out that there's always going to be one, that there's a REX IBM provides for migrating from it, and other things like that. And best practice recommendation for the minimal set of SDCs, all that kind of good stuff. And then much more commands. A big change is because we include global access checking, almost every remediation section will have this boilerplate remediation about disabling and removing global access checking. And we're key to point out many, many times that access gained via global access checking is not logged, so it's a lot harder to take it away once you've been using it. Here's how to get a CIS Workbench account. So you would just click on this link, and then you would click here on this little button, go through the account creation process. You're going to want to look for the CIS IBM Z system benchmarks. This is where you get everything for your mainframe system. This is what the community looks like. You can see there's a lot of discussions here. Tickets, this is where you would ask questions if you need some clarification about what is actually intended by a benchmark or recommendation. Here's an example of a current community discussion we've got going on right now. It's a poll to see if we want to take these existing health checks and create recommendations from them. Right now, the AIM stage 3 required for certain RACF features. If you want a vSAM dataset database 2, NQ name is not in the GRS resource name list. That can cause corruption of your RACF database. RACF default IBM user is disabled. That one's going to go in there. And enabled for sysplex communication, that you can see a little bit more about it if you go to the discussion of why we think that should be included. And this is what I really was kind of hoping for from this, besides just allowing people to bring some awareness of the CIS benchmark. We really depend on community involvement for this. So there are two very important discussions going on right now. Once they're resolved, then we'll be able to go forward with our publishing plans for this draft release. So one of them is just a soliciting interest in new recommendations. I'm just going to go to that link after this and talk more about them. And the other one is feedback on how to handle access list remediation recommendations. CIS benchmarks are meant to be very broadly applicable. Yeah, so I think I'll just go to those. Here we have the session feedback one. I am going to get out of this. There we go. So I can go to the CIS benchmarks themselves.
Right. Thank you, Daniel. That was very interesting. Has anybody got any questions they want to ask? Nothing in the chat at the moment. I'm sure, Mark, you've got a question, haven't you? Or do you?
Okay. Am I sharing my screen for these?
Yes, just leave the... Oh, all right. Don't worry.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So I'm sharing this, going to the thing here where I said I'd preview some of the recommendations that are coming up.
Okay.
So this is one of the ones we were talking about for that. Uh, these are some of the controls we're looking to add and looking to gauge some interest in the community in. Yeah, one of them is recommendations for the IRR resources in the facility class. Those are RACF defined resources. They give you RACF privileges or control RACF behavior. Another one we're looking to add is RACF class authorization. We already have recommendations for operations, audit, read-only auditor, and special. This just extends that for class authorization. Seturops EGN is effect. We're recommending having EGN enabled, primarily because it eases administration and auditing by ensuring that all the RACF resources class, dataset, and general resources use the same naming conventions for generic profiles. We have a level 1 and level 2 control for enhanced generic owner. This offers extra restrictions on the creation of profiles for general resources. We have a generic owner as the level 1 and enhanced generic owner as level 2. Those like level 2s extending a level 1 control. Group list in is in effect. It eases administration and it minimizes the number of time a user has to log on and off by doing list of groups checking. We're recommending adding a recommendation for no add creator in effect. This prevents RACF from placing the profile creator's user ID on the profile access list, which it does by default. We're recommending disabling of statistics for active classes. These statistics are not really accurate. They only work for discrete profiles and only in other certain cases. So if you're relying on them for anything, they're very unreliable. And just having them on increases CPU and IO usage because RACF has to calculate them, and they're not actually really reliable. Seturops real DLSN. This ensures that log printouts, operator messages, and SMF records identify datasets by their real names rather than the ones created by exit routines to conform with RACF naming conventions. Here we have some new feature, I think Mark announced yesterday for the RVary password to have it secured by KDFAES. Just getting rid of DES. A new one related to the VTAM Apple class. We want that class, we're recommending that class be enabled. It controls application control block opening. You can abuse those with certain tricks to gain elevated access or to mislead users by preventing false logon screens and scraping authentication data. So it's just important to have that class turned on. And we're going to ensure, a recommendation that the ICSF master keys are managed by ICSF master keys managed by the trusted key entry workstations. This is really the only way to load them, in a secure way so that they never appear in clear text. There's some level 2 recommendations. These are level 2 at the moment. They could be level 1. Again, we're looking for some community feedback on that. One of them is the IRR alter profiles in the facility class. This changes the behavior of RACF. Right now, if you have alter access for certain types of profiles, permit this user ID or group alter, they gain RACF control over that profile. This just changes it so that they only have that alter access. They get no other extra privileges within RACF itself. We're making it a level 2 because it is a change in longstanding RACF behavior, and there are, we feel that some people maybe would have to change and give more granular access than relying on this behavior. There's the ACE check resource class being enabled. This is a newer feature to RACF. What it does is it allows you for you to detect when a program modifies the ACE, the accessor environment for a user ID, and optionally prevent that to say that only these specific programs or applications or tasks are allowed to do that. But it's not, if you have not been prepared for it, it can be a bit of a migration. When you're enabling it, you have to create the profiles to say that this message is okay, this application's okay, this application's okay. So it can create an initial flood when you're doing this and enabling it. So we've kept it at a level 2 recommendation. Cat DNS failures is in effect. This means that, a data set has to be cataloged before being accessed through normal data set profiles. We're keeping it as level 2 just because it can be a little bit of a CPU thing in certain environments, depending on how many uncatalogued data sets you have. This is enhanced generic owner that extends the generic owner. And we're also doing about validated boot. With validated boot, ZOS, your installation, it checks to make sure that your IPL programs are intact and untampered with using hashing and certificates and things, so that you're booting from a trusted build time source. That's a very important discussion. Would really love to have some feedback on that, or whether there are more controls you'd like to see added, ideas for controls. It's very community driven. So, and the other one is feedback on ACO permit recommendations. Just in short, a lot of them have current recommendations for resources have some basic guidelines on who can access at what level. But those people, like here where it says auditors, security administrators, system programmers, none of these terms are defined in the benchmark. So it implies a role group structure that is not documented or mandated by a benchmark. So we're trying to think of a better way to handle this to make sure that those permits are evaluated during an audit, or when you're running a CIS benchmark, but we need a better way of providing that information, because we cannot provide a role structure. We'd end up in the same problem that people have with following the DISA STIGs, where their role structure does not match to the site's role structure. What we're thinking of doing is moving this to a more generic, like authorized users at read level, and then providing in the discussion section some recommendations for what we think those people are, some guidance, so that the people implementing this and the people responsible for making sure that you conform with the CIS benchmark recommendation, or an auditor performing it, have some common vocabulary for discussing and negotiating whether or not those are valid permits. And that might involve a pseudo role table where we would say auditor, instead of having it as a hard requirement, it would be moved up a section to the discussion to say auditor should have access at read, and then a table in the beginning that would define what an auditor is. I think that those are the two discussions we're really looking to get some feedback from the community on before we publish. And we're looking to publish this draft version because it's had a lot of changes. Sometime Q3, Q4. Okay. There we go. I'm done with my session now. As always, we're looking for feedback and a review.
Got one question in the chat from Peter Buckley. It's just saying, can we expect a revised CIS standard for NZ Secure shortly after the new benchmark?
Yes. I mean, I can't make any promises there, but considering that I am one of the contributors for the draft thing, and I'm also on the Z-Secure team, I can confidently say that they will not follow, that it will not lag behind very shortly. Again, I make no promises, but I would be very surprised if they were not, if there was a large gap between the benchmark being published and a Z-Secure implementation.
Okay. I've allowed all the participants to unmute themselves if they've got any other questions they want to ask in person. I'll take that as a no. All right. Okay then, so please, can I say again, let's do it that way. Please, can I say again that we would like your feedback? I've told you how to do it. One thing I didn't say to you was that if you provide feedback, you will get a CPD or CBE certificate, however you want to call it, that you can use to attest to your annual requirements for whatever organization needs them. So apart from that, thank you very much, Daniel. That was a very interesting discussion. And if there's no questions or nothing else to say, I will bid you all goodbye.